As hostilities in Syria escalated over the alleged use of chemical weapons, I spoke with the director of Carnegie's Middle East Center on the region's deepening conflict. And as global economies debate over free or fair trade, China and Japan are looking at the bright side of deepening economic integration. What are the new growth points to be tapped into? Welcome to The Point, live from Beijing. I'm Liu Xin. The U.S. and its allies conducted airstrikes in Syria last week before the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, or OPCW, was able to conduct an investigation on whether chemical weapons were used in an attack on April the 7th in Douma, a town near Syria's capital Damascus that killed dozens of people. A 7-year Syrian war has already displaced millions of Syrians. How are the coalition strikes likely to impact the displacement situation, and what are the prospects of Syrian refugees returning anytime soon? Earlier, I spoke with Dr. Maha Yahya, director of the Carnegie Middle East Center. I started by asking her what are the needs of Syrian refugees waiting to return.
Without bringing everybody around the table to discuss a political settlement, it's impossible to do that thing. Definitely, I mean, if the question is about whether we should have elections soon, I think that would be the biggest mistake. I don't think elections are the way to go. This is a country that is in conflict. It would be impossible for people to vote freely within the country, those that are within the country.
But my question really is, if the precondition for many of these refugees to come back to Syria is that President Assad must go, I guess that's not going to happen anytime soon.
No, it's not, and it's not going to happen anytime soon unless there is some sort of a political settlement. I think we need to distinguish between President Assad and the regime. I think everyone has been very fixated on the persona of the president. Nobody's talking about regime change a la Iraq, where you dismantle institutions and you dismantle the entire state apparatus. But I think there has to be a serious discussion about what kind of political transition that can create inclusive political processes that will give assurances to Syrian citizens, both those within the country and outside the country, that they will be safe, that there will be justice, that there will be accountability. When we spoke to the refugees in Lebanon and Jordan and asked them what was the Syria they were looking for, nobody talked about wanting to change, to have a president of a certain ethnic identity. On the contrary, they talked about having a just Syria, an accountable Syria, a free Syria, and a Syria that remains intact.
Are they able to accept President Assad being the president?
They cannot accept his presence because they don't believe they will be safe under his auspices, if you want. They do not trust that he will be able to guarantee their safety and security and the safety and security of their children. These are people who fled, many of them, fled the barrel bombs that were launched by the regime of Bashar al-Assad. So the idea that you're asking them to go back to live under the auspices or under the control of a president who forced them to flee in the first place is almost impossible for them. They will have no sense of safety and security. I think above and beyond this as well, the sense is that having gone through 7 years of conflict, the tolerance of the regime to any kind of dissent was even much less than it was before, far less than it was before.
Do you think after the seven years of war, conflict, deaths, destruction, do you think once the political processes really are able to start, the government of President Assad is not able to take any lesson from the 7 years of war?
They haven't so far. And actually the lesson that they've given everybody, whether it's the Syrians or the international community, is that they will stop. I mean, there are no red lines, and that there is no measure they will not take to guarantee a continued control, including the use of chemical weapons, if not, whether it's the last attack that happened in Douma or the previous ones where you've had international and United Nations impartial investigations into these, and that showed that the regime was responsible for these. So the sense that there are no red lines and that they will do what it takes to stay in power, including the use of chemical weapons. I think that, to my mind, that's the lesson they've given everybody, but I haven't seen any lessons that they have learned. On the contrary, in the past, as there is more and more consolidation of territory, the rhetoric of we are winning and therefore we do not need to give anything up, we do not need to talk to the opposition, we do not need to engage with the opposition, these are just simply traitors and therefore we don't need to consider them. So this kind of victor takes all mentality does not make for an inclusive political process. It does not create an environment where people will feel safe to go back and will feel reassured that their children will have a future. And I think this is where kind of the punches for many.
Well, I have to say at this moment we do not know, right, whether or not chemical weapon was really used in Douma, because what we heard are channeled information from some parties, and then what we saw are some images which have not been verified by UN personnel. The report that you quoted that was done last year also only came to the conclusion that chemical weapon was used, but it never really pointed the finger at the Syrian government, that exactly was them, that they did it. Actually, to the contrary, the Syrian government has said that they don't possess any weapons of any chemical weapon, that they haven't used it, even barrel bombs. President Assad has repeatedly denied that he's using barrel bombs. Of course, it's not for me to make these judgments, right? I have never been on the ground, so I do not know, but I can only trust the authoritative reports that's done by independent investigation led by the UN, and yet there is not one UN or international investigation which has come to the conclusion saying that it's President Assad or some other forces that supports President Assad that is behind these attacks.
There have been quite a few reports that indicate that he was involved. I mean, that the regime was involved in chemical attacks. That's one. As for the barrel bombs, there definitely also have been multiple reports. The UN has the Impartial Commission, amongst many other UN entities, have shown the regime to be culpable in ethnic cleansing, in sectarian cleansing, in population transfers, and in the use of barrel bombs. The use of barrel bombs consistently across most of Syrian territory. There are images that are indisputable, but also impartial investigations that show this. This is not a fabrication. Now, there is a war of narratives, of course.
I'm not saying it has to be fabrication. I'm not also defending for President Assad, but I'm saying because the tendency is some countries can allege that something has happened in another country and then using this as a pretext to intervene militarily, as what we have seen in Iraq, which is a terrible mistake, and the people who are behind it yet to be brought into accountability. So this is a lesson, and we don't want the same kind of lesson to repeat in the country of Syria or anywhere else in this world. That's why there is such a quarrel at the United Nations, how to conduct a really impartial investigation.
Look, unfortunately, getting the use of chemical weapons is one red line, and I think it's a very important one and one that needs to be upheld.
Right.
But getting embroiled in the issue of whodunit, this is a regime that has...
But you have to... Sure. No, anybody who uses chemical weapon to kill its own people, definitely, I think it is not acceptable.
Above and beyond that, above and beyond the chemical weapons, the barrel bombs themselves have caused more civilian deaths than the chemical weapons themselves. So if there is a moral argument to be held here or to be done here, it's about what has been happening. This is a regime that has devastated its country, its population over the past 7 years. So if we want to talk about accountability, it's not just about, let's not just fixate on the chemical weapons and whether the regime did it or didn't. I hear you absolutely on what happened in Iraq and the use of the allegation that not only that they had chemical weapons, but that somehow Saddam was responsible for
he was accused of using chemical weapons to kill his own people too.
Well, he did use them in Halabja, but that was much earlier. He wasn't. The war was not about Halabja,
no.
Which was the attack against the Kurds.
No, I think okay, a moral judgment is, again, what you need to do is to base your international consensus on facts, not on morality.
But these are facts.
Because you really need to come to a conclusion. Really, did President Assad use chemical weapon against his own people? If you have that conclusion, okay, nobody can say anything. The reason why there is such a dispute in the international community, in the UN Security Council right now, is how do you come to indisputable, impartial conclusion that there is chemical weapon attack by the president? And one of the requests that the Russians demand is that the Russian government information or evidence need also be taken into consideration, which has been rejected by the Americans in the draft resolution that they have come up with. Why not? Why not the government information has to be excluded from consideration?
I'm not going to defend the American or the other. I am all for an impartial investigation into
so am I.
who conducted the... But what I'm saying is that in the past, there have been investigations that have shown that the regime has used chemical weapons against its own population.
Again,
but above and beyond the use of chemical weapons, above and beyond that, the use of barrel bombs, the ferocity, the sieges, chemical weapons have not been the only tool of war that the regime has used against its own population. Douma has been under siege with no food or water going in or going out. Medical facilities have been targeted. Educational facilities have been targeted by the regime. If you want to talk, I mean, there are multiple tools that have been used in this cause.
That have been used. I know the starvation has been said to be a tool of the government to really,
to submit people.
To submit people. What about the opposition who, despite having no food, having no medical care, and still hold on to the terror, using the people as hostage to fight against the enemies? They also... Do they have higher moral ground?
All I can say is this is a government that is responsible. It is responsible for the well-being of people.
Of course, I
have to hold it to a much higher standard than I would hold any non-state actor. I have to hold the government to a much higher standard. It is responsible for the well-being. When a government and a state uses the kinds of tactics that the Syrian government has been, and Bashar al-Assad have been willing to use against their own population in order to remain victorious and hold on to power, then there is a big question mark. Well, you had a civilian uprising in 2011. For 7 months, that civilian uprising was peaceful. It was the response of the government was not to look at what was triggering people's grievances. It came down with a heavy hand. It came down with you had children's fingernails that were pulled out. As a response to this uprising.
I'm not saying I support any of but let the people decide what is the political process they want, what is the result that they want to have for the future.
Which people?
The Syrian people, the people who will be involved in the negotiation for the political transition. They will decide ultimately if they can come to a conclusion as to what to do next, whether they have a constitution, whether they're going to have election, and so on and so forth. But without the war coming to an end, there will not be a peaceful transition.
That I cannot agree with you more. What I'm trying to say is that with the prospect of the war coming to an end, given the multiple actors that are involved today in the Syrian conflict, and that include the Turks, the Russians, the Iranians, the Americans, the Jordanians, the Israelis. I mean, there are too many actors who are involved in the conflict itself. Without a kind of international consensus to bring this war to an end, that won't happen. That's one. Two, the Syrian government itself that feels today it is winning because it is reconsolidating its control over particular parts of Syrian territory, has indicated over and over again that it is not willing to engage in a political discussion one that could bring about an end to the conflict.
Okay, a very heavy topic, but we have to leave it there. Thank you so much, Dr.
Pleasure.
Maha Yahya, Director of the Carnegie Middle East Center. And here is my point before we go to the break. I just want to say that there is one picture that is going viral on the Chinese social media. That was a picture of the Syrian ambassador to the UN sitting in front of a window, his face buried in his palms, looking tired and helpless. I do not know the circumstances under which this photo was shot, but I can understand the feeling this photo was able to trigger in the eyes of many Chinese who are retweeting it. Syria was weak and had no say over its own fate on the international arena, and just like what China was many years ago, its officials were humiliated in front of their foreign counterparts. Now, human society has experienced 2 world wars followed by 70 years of peaceful development and rule-based governance, yet military might is still the rule of the day. It is not acceptable to use chemical weapons, I repeat, but it was also unacceptable to strike a sovereign country without duly recognized justification. The respect for sovereignty was one of the fundamental pillars of the modern world, as enshrined in the UN Charter, and to resolve disputes through peaceful political means instead of military force is the consensus of the majority of countries in the world. Any player bucking that trend might get away with it for the moment, but the trend is unstoppable. You're watching The Point. I'll be back right after this. China's top diplomat Wang Yi met Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in Tokyo on Monday, and exploring new momentum for economic and trade cooperation was high on the agenda. The meeting came as China and Japan are holding the first high-level economic talks in 8 years. Wang Yi arrived in Japan on Sunday for a 3-day visit where he chaired the 4th high-level economic dialogue between China and Japan alongside Japanese Foreign Minister Taro Kono. So what new economic opportunities are budding between Asia's 2 largest economies? I'm joined in Beijing by Sitao, Chief Economist at Deloitte China, and in Tokyo, Dr. Naoyuki Yoshino, Dean of the Asian Development Bank Institute. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Sitao, now 2018 marks 40 years of friendship treaty between China and Japan, and in September last year, China became Japan's second largest export market and largest source of import. So how would you describe the current economic climate between the 2 countries and how it has changed over the past 8 years?
Well, despite the so-called cold political situation between 2 countries, economically, the trade has been doing extremely well between China and Japan. Not only China has become Japan's largest market, and consistently Japan is deriving roughly $20 billion trade surplus from China, and the trend is going even stronger.
Well, last year, Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe made a qualified pledge of cooperation on Chinese President Xi Jinping's signature Belt and Road Initiative, or China's Belt and Road Initiative, rather. And during this week's meeting, both sides emphasized the importance of new initiative as a new growth point for bilateral cooperation. So, Dr. Yoshino, what kind of concrete cooperation can the 2 countries explore in this regard?
I think the one road and one belt is very important for the entire development of Asian regions, and infrastructure investment is the key to develop the regions. And Japan has their experience in infrastructure investment. One of the key points is how to develop the region along the new highway or railway and so on. I think construction of infrastructure itself is not important. However, the development of the region is very important. And Japan had experienced in many Asian countries to develop the region. One thing is whether the infrastructure is focusing on manufacturing industries, whether infrastructure is development of agriculture sectors, or it will develop services sector. So one road, one belt is a very good idea, but the purpose of the development will be different from region by region. Those things has to be learned between Japan and China.
Sitao, what is China's official attitude toward Japan coming on board this initiative? Does China welcome it? Does China have any reservation? What is the Chinese official position?
China's official position is clearly welcoming Japan's involvement. In fact, China's official position is for everyone to be part of this initiative, so not just limiting to Japan. But as the Japanese professor has said, Japan has a strong track record in this part of the world where diversity, for example, in terms of language, religion, culture, cannot be underestimated. So China, Japan can work together.
Also, Japanese Foreign Minister Kono said that it is possible for Japan to join the Belt and Road Initiative under certain conditions. So, Dr. Yoshino, what are these conditions? Do you think China can possibly meet these conditions?
I think Japanese people use Chinese characters. So we have a very close connections since a long time ago. And Japanese and Chinese should work together for lots of international organizations. And one of the projects between Pakistan and China, Pakistan side was constructed by ADB. And then Chinese side was constructed by AIIB. And the road was connected each other. I think there are lots of joint effort can be made to make our cooperation will become much, much stronger. And also we should not antagonize each other, but China, Japan, very friendship relations in short term, long term will create a big stability in the Asian region. So not only economics, but also policies has to have shake hands each other.
Right. Well, that seems to be the understanding from some economics, from some scholars or even business people. But Sitao, what do you perceive to be some of the conditions that the Japanese government was meaning when they talked about certain conditions?
I could only speculate. I suspect the desire or request from developed countries regarding Belt and Road is for China to perhaps slightly weaken the role of state-owned companies so that the project could be more inclusive. In fact, if Japanese companies can be involved, not Japanese government, Japanese private companies can be involved in building infrastructure in Thailand or Pakistan, I actually think the geopolitical risk could be mitigated.
Dr. Yoshino, what is your response to what Sitao said just now?
I think infrastructure requires very good quality. Otherwise, that cannot be sustainable. So quality of infrastructure is, yes, skills of Japanese technologies. And China has now lots of money. And China and Japan can construct together of various infrastructures. And connectivities are very important between Asian countries and China and Japan. And big Asia has to be created. Infrastructure is the key. Then infrastructure can develop regions of small businesses, agricultural sectors, and so on. So not only constructing infrastructure itself, but develop the regions along those infrastructures are very important. So in that sense, China-Japan's cooperation and working together will be very important in Asian region.
Right. Another very important piece of message that came out of the past few days was President Xi Jinping's speech at the Boao Forum for Asia, where he pledged and announced some new and concrete measures for China's reform and opening up 40 years on. Dr. Yoshino, how has his message gone down with Japanese businesses? And now that the political relationship is warming up, how do Japanese businesses expect the future to be tapped?
I think Japan had opened a long time ago because Japan was negotiating with the United States. Japan had huge surplus to U.S. and U.S. approach to Japan to change exchange rate mechanism and capital openings. I think China can learn from Japanese lessons, gradual opening of capital market and also development of domestic financial institutions are very important. Don't go too quickly. Gradual adjustment is the key for China to cope with many, many big disputes in trade.
Another issue that has been pretty much at the fore of international media is the trade friction between China and the United States. During the meeting between Chinese and Japanese diplomats, Wang Yi said that both China and Japan will safeguard economic globalization and free trade, while Japanese Foreign Minister Kono added that Japan is willing to safeguard the global free trade system based on WTO rules, help maintain the growth of momentum of global economy, and promote further development of regional cooperation. Let's remind us that Japan also joined the United States while to bring up the request for consultation at the World Trade Organization concerning China's alleged infringement on intellectual property. So, Sitao, are the two countries on the same page regarding trade protectionism? And if not, how can they manage their differences and still promote exchanges?
Of course, China still has a long way to go in terms of improving market access. That's why President Xi Jinping addressed this head-on at his keynote speech in Boao. But at the same time, if we look at Japan, which is much more developed economy, arguably the market is also quite protected. So in this part of the world, I think all countries have to do certain things during the catch-up period. So I think that's why China and Japan should work together. But at the same time, if U.S. is really stepping up pressures on trade, probably Japan will be also joining that effort.
Dr. Yoshino, my last question really, now the U.S. is Japan's biggest economic partner. However, as I said at the beginning of this section, China is also very important in terms of trade with Japan. And at the same time, we're expecting Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe to meet U.S. President Donald Trump next week in Mar-a-Lago. So how is Japan going to balance its relationship with China and its relationship with the United States?
Because Japan was get rid of all the military power after World War II. So Japan used to depend on U.S. forces in Japan. That's why we have to coordinate with United States in that part. However, economic part, China-Japan relation became very important. And Japanese relation with other Asian countries are also growing. So I think politics is somewhat different from economics, and economic cooperations between China and Japan has to go steadily and strongly. And also not only economics, but cultural exchange between students and universities and so on will create long-term good relations within these two countries. And the close connection with Japan and China and strong connection and peace discussion together with two countries will have a stable Asian economy and also stable growth of Asia.
Indeed, I fully agree with you on that, and we're looking forward to further warming tides between Japan and China. I have to leave it there. Many thanks to my two guests, Sitao, Chief Economist of China, and from Tokyo, Dr. Naoyuki Yoshino, Dean of the Asian Development Bank Institute. And that is it for this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with LX. Download the application called CGTN to watch our show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.